Okay, this week we have an interesting guest. He's somebody that I first met through my interaction with the littleBits company. Paul has been working with them and worked with me during the development of their interface bits, and I got a chance to use them early and often. I had a blast with them. They're amazingly fun. But with that, I'd like to introduce you to Paul Rothman. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Good, thanks, Darwin. Great to be here on the show with you.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's a real treat to be able to have you take a little time out of your schedule. I know you're a busy guy, and give us a chance to talk a little bit. Why don't we start off by having you explain your job to us, your gig?
Sure. So I'm currently the director of R&D at littleBits, and so I've sort of spanned a couple of different positions at the company. I started there when the company was first getting off the ground in 2011. Initially, just working with with the founder Aya Bader as an electronics designer, basically doing PCB layouts and module designs, electrical engineering for the product. And as the team has grown, I've kind of shifted around between engineering and design. And at this point, as the director of R&D, I mostly just work more on a conceptual and partially like logistics and execution level with the product. I don't get my hands dirty and solder and do PCB designs anymore. Unfortunately, at some times, but yeah, mostly working on sort of the concepts for the modules, the features and the layouts, the designs of the interfaces and things like that for the product, as well as sometimes partnerships like some of the partnership that we did with Korg, creating the synth kit. So. It's a really great position. I get to kind of think and ideate and try to come up with the next cool thing for the product line.
Right, that's really interesting. What a fantastic job. You must be kind of loving life a little bit, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious because the kind of things you get a chance to do is the kind of things a lot of people would like to do, right? Mm-hmm. What is your background, and how did you get to be in the position you're in?
So I started out, well, I mean, if I go further back, I was always really interested in, taking things apart as a kid. I think that's a common thread in a lot of people that are kind of in an engineering sort of design background. And so, yeah, always interested in electronics. I kind of started getting into electronics actually through music, trying to come up with new sounds and building guitar pedals and things like that. In high school, that was sort of my first introduction to electronics, was by trying to build things to make weird sounds with. So I went to NYU for college, and I ended up getting into the music technology program there. Partially that program is about just more traditional music training, theory and history and things like that. But then also a large part of the curriculum is getting into, basic electronics and, studio recording, synthesis. My first introduction to Max MSP was in a class that Luc Dubois was teaching at NYU, basically an intro to computer music synthesis. And that's when I first learned about Max and got into, programming software. And I also had my first encounters with analog synths. They had an old Buchla 100 system that everybody kind of cut their teeth on in school, and so that was kind of that was kind of really solidifying for me, getting the chance to, really work on music and electronics, which kind of became my two simultaneous passions. And after school, like I finished school, I wanted to try to see if I could do that full time, and I started making guitar pedals and kind of one-off synths in my bedroom. Kind of quickly realized the economy of that was a little difficult to do at the time, and especially in New York. So I ended up going back to school. I got a graduate degree also at NYU in interaction design, and it was actually when I was a student that I met Aya, who was working on littleBits at the time, and this was in 2009. That was basically a project that she was working on, that she was getting some grant funding from an arts organization called iBeam. And so I started working with her as an intern, basically just working on early concepts of the system before there was a connector to really hold everything together. We kept in touch, and so I kind of kept doing the freelance electronics work and design for folks. And then once the company got started in 2011, I joined straight away, and we've just been kind of working at it ever since.
Sure. Well, that's really an interesting lead-in, and I find it really interesting that you kind of have this combination of music technology from NYU and then the interactive design or interaction design. That's kind of an extension of the typical media arts, but one that's really growing in importance. You see it a lot with people that are focusing on, a lot of times in the software world, you're seeing them focused on user interaction, the typical UX kind of gig. But it's really interesting to hear about interaction design as part of like hardware development, and especially development that includes electronics. Is it as strange as I think, or am I just missing the boat on what's out there?
I don't know. I don't know how strange it is. I guess I definitely would say that when I was in my undergrad at NYU, there weren't that many people doing electronics. A lot of the program, a lot of my classmates were much heavier into the recording aspect of the program. That was what the bulk of the students were doing. They were musicians and really interested in being audio engineers and producers.
I see.
Which was great, and I was interested in that stuff too, but it just didn't capture my imagination quite as much as, being in the studio with the Buchla and, the MS-20 and cutting quarter-inch tape and
Right.
and all that kind of stuff, and, experimenting. And so, yeah, that's really sort of what captured my imagination, and interacting with all of the different instruments and interfaces sparked something in me, I guess. We also had an EMS, a VCS3, the Putney,
Right.
another kind of classic synth, and a very interesting interface with the Matrix patch panel that it has. So, kind of jumping from modular to semi-modular to this sort of patch matrix and all these different sorts of interfaces, and looking at different ways to approach music creation and the hardware behind it. So I wanted to sort of be in that field, and so kind of getting into creating the guitar pedals and the synths, and at that point I was learning a lot. I think the guitar pedal was actually the first PCB that I designed, right. And it ended up being something I was manufacturing and selling to people into stores. So that was a learning experience and something that was really interesting. And then when I got to the interactive telecommunications program at NYU, I really just focused on designing instruments as much as I could. I took other classes that were doing different things, coding and different sorts of interactions. But whenever I could do a project that ended up being the result was me building some sort of electronic instrument or some way of making a sound interface. That was sort of what I was always gravitating toward. Sticking to what I was passionate about when the opportunities kind of arose.
So I'm curious, what guitar pedals is it that you made? What names did they go under?
The company is called fridgebuzzz Electronics, and I was basically just manufacturing at scale a single pedal that I'd created. I was doing other sort of like one-offs and things like that for specific people, like custom stuff. But the pedal is called the Land of the Rising Fuzz, which is a fuzz pedal based on the Shin Companion Fuzz, which is a kind of sought-after pedal from the 60s that, I got turned on to because of its use by Radiohead and Jesus and Mary Chain, and I built one for myself and thought it sounded great, and I made a couple of modifications to it, and I just saw that people were selling the originals for $400, $500, and I thought, well, I could make these and sell them to people for a lot cheaper than that.
Sure.
And that's kind of how it started. I thought I would make like 25 to begin with, and then I think I ended up making probably around 175 in the end. So, and I still have some parts left that I feel like I'll eventually build out in the future, but I kind of hung up the lab coat on that for the time being.
Hung up the soldering iron, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
So now, during this time when you were making instruments and stuff, you one time let slip, when we were talking, you let slip that you had been to NIME, which is the...
New Interfaces for Musical Expression.
There you go. I always forget what the N is for. New Interfaces for Musical Expression, right. What did you do and what did you show at NIME?
So what I showed at NIME, and this was in the 2010 NIME conference in Sydney, Australia, if anybody's curious in looking up the paper that I submitted. But I wrote a paper about an instrument that I designed, which was actually my master's thesis, which was an instrument that I called the Ghost, which was a MIDI controller that was sort of reprogrammable, partly inspired by the Monome that Brian Crabtree designed, partially inspired by the Suzuki Omnichord, and partially inspired by just the electric guitar. So I kind of made a new interface pulling different ideas from all three of those. So the thing actually looks like a guitar, and you press buttons with your left hand and you strum a touch-sensitive plate with your right hand, but that's sort of like where the similarities stop. It's not the buttons aren't a one-to-one translation to guitar. It's just my thinking was that so many times people try to come up with a completely new interface and it falls flat because it's just strange to people. So
it's too foreign.
It's too foreign, exactly. And I'd say probably the electric guitar is the last, new instrument. I guess you could say the synthesizer, but again, both of those are also playing off of previously designed instruments, piano, synthesizer is using a keyboard, going back to like piano and harpsichord and everything. And, you could make an argument that a guitar is a modern day lute or something. So playing off of the form factor of the guitar so that people wouldn't look at it and be like, oh, that's weird. I wouldn't want to be, on stage with something like that. And just because people are familiar with the gestures, you're moving your hand, along a neck and using your fingers to press down on an interface, and the right hand is also partially controlling the sound as well. So the interesting thing, again, like pulling from the Monome, was that I was working on it being one open source, but also reprogrammable so that there would be an interface that the user could select those buttons to mean anything. They could mean chords, they could mean individual notes, the scales could be set to anything that you wanted, and then also because it was, a line of illuminated buttons, you could use it to be a sequencer, and you could program, drums along the neck and that kind of thing. And so, there were some other performance controllers, like a ribbon controller, an accelerometer in the body that you could tilt the instrument and it would do different things. So that was something that I was interested in maybe pursuing as a instrument, as a controller to manufacture. And I even went as far as meeting with the folks at Livid down in Austin, Texas, who were really great guys, and met with me and kind of talked about manufacturing costs and things like that. And ultimately, I just didn't feel like I was in a position to go into business for myself at that point. This was like pre-Kickstarter, really kind of getting off the ground. And,
right.
The idea of trying to raise capital for something like this seemed a bit daunting. So it's been hanging on my wall in my apartment for the last 5 years. But it's a concept that I think is interesting, and maybe one day would revisit it to see if there's a market for it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because a while back I did an interview with Keith McMillan, and he talked about, he makes controllers of all sorts, but he at the time talked about how he thinks that there's, or at least his guess is that we're never going to invent another instrument because we've gotten married to the shapes and the carriage of the instruments we currently have. So everything in the future will just be a hybrid of what we already have.
Yeah, I mean, part of me hopes that that's not true. But,
I know, me too, but
I also see the landscape. The Eigenharp came out just about the same time that I was finishing up the Ghost prototype, and that has a lot of expression to it, and it sort of looks like an oboe, but it's also seemingly like very strange and futuristic. And I don't know what the numbers are in terms of people that play that instrument, but I think that suffers the same kind of way. I think the most compelling things that I've seen recently are things like, this has been around for a while, but the Haken Continuum, I think, is a really interesting interface.
I agree.
I've never actually played one, but, from what I've seen, it seems like it's very expressive, and again, kind of lending itself to a keyboard type interface, but adding these extra axes and things like that.
The Hakim or like the new Rolly C-board.
Yeah.
Again, similar. What they're able to do is they build off an interface that we not only understand, but music's been written for this stuff, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so we could take advantage of sort of like the content capability that we already have and just bring some new controlleristic things along for the ride.
Yeah, the Rolly, I think that the C-board is a really interesting thing. I've also never played it, but it's something that has interest. I'm not a virtuosic piano player by any means, but it's something that you can sit down and just sort of immediately play. I think that the interesting thing is thinking, is there a new instrument that somebody would have to step into without any sort of previous knowledge of it? Sitting down to the Rolly, if you play the piano, you can play that.
Well, maybe. Now, the other thing is, so I have played a Rolly, and one of the things is, since it has sort of like a multi-dimensional controllerism to it, the things you think of as like pianoistic playing don't seem to fire off the sensors in just quite the way you'd hope or you'd expect. Okay. And so I think that's one of those things where maybe keyboard technique is an okay starting point, but you would have to develop technique specific to that instrument in order to really activate the controllers and stuff right.
Yeah, and I think that's more interesting is when you're looking at an instrument where you need to not just bring experience you have from another instrument, but generate new technique.
Right.
From what I've seen from the Linstrument that Roger Lynn just debuted, also seems like some of the theory and some of the ideas from the keyboard and from guitar would benefit somebody sitting down to the instrument, but at the same time, you can kind of you would bring something. The instrument would bring something new out of you in terms of the expression.
Wow. This is interesting, and it's especially interesting because you've had to approach it from the standpoint of actually making an instrument. Now, one of the things I want to explore a little bit is, well, what a funny use of words, is the development of the littleBits. I mean, It sounds like you were there right from the early days, and I'm wondering to what extent, first of all, your experience with not only building instruments, but also working with modular synthesizers and semi-modulars and a lot of different sort of creative interfaces, how much of that was informing to you when it came to developing the littleBits?
I think a lot of it, especially with the synth kit. I mean, the synth kit, I don't think it wouldn't have been possible if I didn't have those previous experiences with analog synthesizers and music technology. That was an idea that I, kind of felt really passionate about from the time that the company started, and it was always one of those things that was, let's see when that would make sense in the trajectory of the company, because obviously when we started, it wasn't about music. It's just about electronics in general. So our first modules were things like buttons and LEDs and motors and sensors, like for pressure and for light, and knobs, for like rotary potentiometers and things like that. So I think having experience with some of these modular elements, and just also being very focused on interface as a musician, and dealing with musical instruments, so much of what the littleBits product is interface, and keeping that simple and keeping that intuitive, so that people who don't have backgrounds in electronics aren't running away because they think that this is something for engineers.
Right.
So a lot of it is just really about distilling the essence of the electronic function that you want to provide people, and not have it be over featured, and not have it fall flat from what the intention is. So I think it's played a strong part in sort of my contribution to the development of the product.
Right. Well, I think actually too, some history with guitar pedals would make a lot of sense, because if you think about it in terms of music instrument technology, and especially electronics technology, the guitar pedal sometimes can be phenomenally expressive, and certainly phenomenally complicated potentially, but that complication and that expressivity needs to occur within something that is small enough to sort of like be on the floor, and maybe have two buttons, and maybe have as many as 5 knobs, but anything more than that becomes impractical for that kind of device. So you would end up having to do some like rationalization of the user interface. And I look at guitar pedals, and I think sometimes the user interface design is remarkably mature, and in that, and especially in well-designed electronics, a single knob might have multiple effects on the sound. And some of it is because, like, if you're doing an overdrive, that's just the nature of an overdrive system. But also in the case, if you're doing something like an expressive delay pedal, you simply can't have a knob for every function, so you have to somehow collate those into a usable interface. And I think that guitar pedal design is kind of a remarkable area and one that was developed really organically.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, and I mean, I'd say that the trajectory is similar. If you look at guitar pedals from the '60s, the original ones, there's an on-off switch and maybe one or two controls. Maybe you're controlling, the volume or the gain and tone, for the early fuzz pedals. And now, I mean, if you look at some fuzz pedals, there could be, half a dozen or more controls to tweak, every little parameter. And so, I have a sort of a design aesthetic that lends itself towards restraint
Right.
over features. And so, and I think also with synthesizers, a similar sort of thing as technology progresses, there's the interfaces become a lot more cluttered. There's more options, which is great. But at the same time, at least in my view of it, you're kind of going away from, some of the original concept, which is like this user interface that is intuitive. Sometimes I feel like hardware at some point you might as well just do it in a computer. Right. because the interface becomes so complicated. I'm pretty strongly against menus in that regard. If it goes beyond pressing a shift key or something like that to change the function of a bank of buttons, I sort of lose interest with the instrument just because I want to be really present with it and not have to think about how it's functioning so much.
Yeah, I agree completely. And actually, even on the computer, if you have to go through too many mode screens or whatever, it simply becomes uninteresting to explore the editing functions then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of like minimalist design, you probably have the ultimate job for that because so my background with the littleBits was that I got an opportunity. Somebody came to a local meetup and showed the littleBits the synth kit, and they gave us a little coupon for 20% off or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I used the coupon to get it, and I started playing with it, and I was like, wow, this is fun. And I actually even built a little part of a live set that would use them. It was pretty great. But I was also kind of amazed by the difficult decisions that must have been made because there are, I mean, how many, when you connect littleBits together, and for those people who are listening who haven't seen it yet, you need to go to littlebits.cc and check out what these are because they're sort of like electronics Legos. It's the closest thing I can imagine to describing them in a phrase. But all of the signal content is carried over some lines in this magnetic hookup. How many actual signal lines are there?
So there's four conductor or three conductors that go through the system. One of which is ground, one of which is power, the VCC line, and then there's just one line of information, which is our signal pin, which is basically just sending an analog voltage between 0 and 5 volts DC from one module to the next. And so it's a very simple kind of infrastructure that we have right now, but you can end up doing quite a bit of it. So, the closest analog, would be in a modular synth. You're just using voltages to control the interaction between modules. There's no digital protocol at the moment.
Right. So the concept really is when you string up a line of these, it's almost like the traditional guitar pedal stream or whatever, where it's like items connected by a single cable. That's literally how simple the signal flow is, right?
Yeah, and similar to somebody using guitar pedals, the sound changes depending on how you have them connected. The order matters, and there's different sort of logic that can happen between one to the next. So, if you put a delay module in front of an oscillator, it's going to do something different than if you put the delay after the oscillator. So it leaves a lot of room for experimentation in that way.
Yeah, I would say that when I first tried it, I was a little bit frustrated with how almost overly simplistic it seemed.
Mm-hmm.
Until I started realizing that the way that system is because of the simple signal path, what it really did to me was it kind of preferenced playing with the order of things, and especially trying things that are outside the typical signal flow. So, like you said, the idea of putting a delay in front of an oscillator seems crazy. Or, one of the things I love doing, I love playing with the split and mix bits, and splitting things out and processing them differently, and then recombining them, and maybe using delays to combine them, with phase offsets and stuff. It was fascinating because I found myself doing things with. I have some really nice modular synth stuff, and I found myself doing things with the little bits that I'd never conceived of doing with the modular system.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things, and a lot of musicians that I've sent kits out to. That's the exact feedback that I get, which is that this allowed me to do something that I wouldn't have done if I sat down at my modular or at my my semi-modular synth or whatever. And so that's the thing that I really enjoy about it, is the fact that it is kind of a new interface in the way that you think about it is different from, I call it, a traditional analog synthesizer. So it makes you do things that you maybe wouldn't normally do, but also, like a modular synth, having more modules allows you to do more things. So if you had a Eurorack synth where you just had one oscillator and one envelope and one VCF, you're limited. But once you start multiplying those, you can have all these parallel signal and control paths going and doing some really interesting things. So the walls are really wide in the system in the sense that you can kind of branch out, even though on a singular module level, the features are not deep. It's more about how you have the modules interact with one another to get these sort of interesting and new kind of sounds.
Right. Now, the synth kit was developed in combination with Korg, who's known for making very traditional instruments. Now, recently they've kind of branched off into the historical world of making, remaking MS-20 type devices. Their Volca series is kind of a really interesting new interface, but this to me was a real departure because while musical, it doesn't seem instrument-like on its surface. How did you get them interested in the product and in working with it, and what was the process of working with them like?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. So the partnership goes back to 2012, actually. And like I said, I had this concept in sketches for a littleBits based synthesizer sort of platform. And so it had kind of just been sitting in a notebook for a while because we were trying to build out more sort of traditional modules. And then at the end of 2012, we received an email from Tadahiko Sakamaki from Korg, who is in charge of their product planning, saying, hey, I'm going to be in New York and what you're doing is interesting. Can we have a meeting? And so, we ended up talking. They were interested in basically working with us on the idea that we were already interested in doing, which was, synthesis and audio within the littleBits system. And, I think Korg in particular for me was a great fit because they had shown in the couple of years preceding that they were interested in these non-traditional interfaces. And so, at the time, back in 2012, there were no Volcas, but they did have the Monotron series, which were, are still these $50 pocket analog synthesizers. It sort of clicked in the sense that, well, they're already making these devices that are geared towards not a professional musician market, although I'm sure professional musicians would buy a Monotron or a Monotribe and play around with it, but it's more trying to reach out to the general public and introducing them to a synthesizer. You know, a $50 commitment is nothing compared to several $100s or several $1,000s that a synthesizer could cost. And so that to me was really interesting. And also the fact that the designer of those who worked and had worked with us on the synth kit and some of the new modules, Tatsuya, and so he had these other ideas around, you know, making those products, although kind of not officially but unofficially hackable, by having these test points and these breakout pads within the circuit boards. So if you take a Monotron apart, there'll be a pad that you could potentially connect to your own electronics, an Arduino or something like that. And so it's that sort of spirit that really gelled with me and with the company, because we make all of our electronics open source. And so the idea that, you know, people are going to be potentially hacking or, you know, opening up and taking a look at what makes these instruments tick, and the fact that they released the schematics for the Monotron, I thought was really interesting, and I kind of saw kindred spirits in Tadahiko and Tatsuya in that regard, which just made it really easy decision to say, you know, let's collaborate on this product together.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. You're right. Now, my question would be, what is the process of designing these things? Because with the synth kit, there had to be a totality of vision. You had to be able to say, you know, this is what is going to represent an instrument or an instrument building kit to us, right?
The interesting thing about the development of the synth kit is that it had to be more of a holistic approach, designing several modules at a time, and basically that whole kit at once, because in 2013, when we did the bulk of the design, we didn't have any audio capabilities in the system. And so with the more traditional development path for us, we are creating an individual module that will add functionality to the system as a whole. So for example, you know, we have a CloudBit module which allows you to connect littleBits to a Wi-Fi network. So that's one module that's expanding all of the other buttons and LEDs and motors and things in the system. But with the synthesizer, we couldn't just release an oscillator and then a keyboard and then an envelope. We had to design all of these at once with the notion that they were going to be packaged in a kit that would be an entire synthesizer experience. And so we went back and forth on a lot of different configurations and what modules needed to be in the kit and what were the nice to haves, and we actually ended up using at Tadahiko's recommendation, we actually ended up using Max to basically simulate the kit. So each one of the modules that we were discussing, the oscillator, the delay, all of these modules was built out by Tadahiko and his team in Max, and then we would go back and forth on saying, well, okay, but this interaction between this module is a little bit weird, and we need to adjust the range of this control. And so by the time we started actually working on the hardware designs, we had kind of specced out how the system would work using Max MSP as sort of a simulation application. So it was really interesting to kind of take the approach of software to hardware in terms of the development of it. And so, yeah, there were back and forths and concessions that had to be made. I know, one of the things that we thought would be really interesting in the kit was going to be to have a looper in there so that you could, basically build up a composition by looping sounds. But ultimately, in terms of like timeline and price consideration, we had to cut that. But there were a lot of different sort of back and forth and configurations that we went through during that design process, which was really interesting and really rewarding and definitely something I look back on fondly.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it was a pretty exciting thing to do, and this idea of developing the interaction before you start making the hardware sounds pretty compelling as well. Oh, and one thing I'll say, there's currently one of the things you guys do is you decide what the next bits are that are going to be made through a voting system, right?
For some of the modules, yeah, we launched in September this platform called the BitLab, which is basically a section of our website where people can submit videos and prototype concepts for new modules, and those modules will get voted on by the public. And so the modules that reach 1,000 votes, we look at really closely, decide on whether or not the features are something that would be worthwhile for the littleBits platform, if we can build it at a price point that will be palatable for our customers, and then put those into production.
Okay, well, I'll just say this. Right now, one of the current voting items is the LFO bit, which I beg all of my listeners to run over there and vote for, because it would be a fantastic addition to the synth kit.
Yeah, and an interesting thing about that module is that was actually a part of the original design of the synth kit, but we were using it just as an oscillator module. And so the original oscillator design was digital. We just thought that we could get a more richer sound experience by designing an analog oscillator, which is what we ended up doing. And so the design for the oscillator, the digital one, kind of fell by the wayside, and we resurrected it kind of recently just by adjusting the range in software to make it a low frequency oscillator. And so we decided to put it up for vote to see if it would be something that would be of interest. And I have to say, having the only prototype, it's a really, really cool thing, and it unlocks a lot for not only synth users but for users of the whole full line, because you can control LEDs and you can control motors in ways that you couldn't with these long timing cycles, and it has also a wave shaping control, so you can change the pulse width of the pulse wave, and you can change the waveform of the triangle saw to have it morph between a sawtooth, a triangle, and a ramp wave. So it adds a lot of interesting functionality. So yeah, I think there's about 2 weeks left. I think we are about 70% of the way as far as voting goes. So I'm hoping that the community comes through, sees the value of it, and goes to the website to vote for it.
Yeah, agreed. I hope so too. Now, just recently, and where I got involved more directly was in the release of these interface bits. What did you call the set of them? I can't remember off the top of my head.
So we've combined them, and we just call them the Synth Pro Pack, because it allows you to connect the synth kit, which was kind of formerly an island into itself, to all of the other gear that you would have in your studios. So we have a module that connects to MIDI, both traditional MIDI DIN as well as USB MIDI. We have a module that is USB I/O, which is basically a USB audio interface that's DC coupled, so it can be used as a recording and playback interface, as well as a control interface, which is where you get to do a lot of really cool interaction with Macs.
Right.
And then a third module, which is CV module, control voltage, which allows you to connect to analog synths, modulars. You can sync with like the vocal line, which have an analog sync input and output. Even the new Teenage Engineering pocket operator synths could be connected to the synth kit via the CV module. So it's really exciting. It's stuff that we had talked about in the original kit, adding MIDI and all of these other connection and interface modules. But in terms of time to development, we just didn't have the resources to do those simultaneously. So we finished the synth kit, released it, and then basically a few months later started working on those new modules, which we just released less than a month ago now.
Right.
They're really awesome. It kind of expands what you can do with the synth kit to definitely a more, not that you couldn't use it for professional purposes, beforehand. There's been some great musicians that have used the synth kit, but now being able to control it from a full size keyboard or have it be connected to Macs allows you to do more sort of traditional, use it as a more traditional instrument in the workflow of a user's music studio.
Right. One of the things I too found was that with the interface bits, it made me more interested in using the non-synth bits. So, for example, all of a sudden, I started using LED bits a lot more because they turned out to be really good voltage meters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do that too. I'll stick LEDs, in various parts of the signal flow of a synth patch that I'm putting together, just to kind of visualize what's going on. We also have another module which is called the bar graph, which kind of can act like a VU meter.
Yep.
And another module called the number module, which kind of allows you to get actual voltage information. It's basically like a voltmeter in that it's a 2-digit 7-segment display interface. So if you wanted to, capture the precise voltages that were coming out of one of your setups, you could do that with that module.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things I noticed was that once that interface kind of like opened the door to like patching it into my modular or patching it into my computer system, both Macs and Live, I was doing both a lot. One of the things I realized is that except for the motor, I never found a way to use the motor usefully. But otherwise, practically everything could take on an interesting musical use. So I bought one of the microphone modules, which is neither a great microphone nor a great interface for audio, right?
Yeah, we're working on an update to that will hopefully address some of those issues.
Sure, but what was cool about it was that, first of all, it had an input jack, so I could plug random stuff into it, but also I could use it as sort of an activator for things like the filter, right? In a very peculiar, in a way that wasn't something that I would have probably designed. It was through the method of experimenting with the littleBits that I actually found an interesting way to do that.
Also of great interest to the synth community we have are our sensor modules. So we have modules that sense pressure, that sense bend, that sense light. In the future, we're potentially going to have an accelerometer module. So all of these things that allow you to create a new interface, a new sort of physical way to interact with the sound is really interesting and something that you don't find in a lot of traditional kind of store-bought synths or even in the modular world that much. These alternative sort of interfaces that use physical control beyond a knob or environmental control like sound or light.
Right. Now, one of the things that I did not get a chance to do was to try and integrate the cloud bit into the system, but practically everything else, and including the Arduino bit, which was actually a lot of fun to work with as well.
There was actually one other thing in terms of the other modules outside of the synth modules that's pretty interesting that I saw actually just this week, which was one of our customers posted a video where he had connected his modular through our CV interface, through the CV module, to a servo module, and he had connected a drumstick to the servo module and had that hitting a cowbell. He was basically syncing, an acoustic instrument to his modular synth using littleBits as a bridge, which was something, that I found to be really creative and interesting and hope to see more of in the future.
Yeah, well, there's that motor interface that I couldn't come up with. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
It seems to me like the musical angle on littleBits has excited people. If for no other reason, then you've kind of come out with additional bits to sort of like honor that system. So I'm thinking it must be doing pretty well. What do you think are the next things in play for those of us who are kind of interested in expanding the synth stuff that littleBits provides?
Yeah. I mean, it has definitely been one of our more popular kits, which is really great. And I think from where we started and what we think of or what we thought of as like our user base, it's a really pleasant surprise how much musicians have taken to it. And so in terms of the development of new modules on our end, outside of the LFO, which we could potentially produce if there's demand for it, I think that some of the other more interesting modules will come in the form of control interfaces. So like I was mentioning before, like other kinds of sensors or actuators that allow you to interact with the sound modules in a different sort of way. And also I'm really interested in seeing what comes from the community. The synth DIY scene is really strong. I'd love to see more people from that scene, coming up with designs and submitting them to the BitLab and just kind of having that community feedback and seeing what comes up from that end of things. So that's kind of my hope and outlook for where we'll sort of evolve. I could see a few more modules coming from the partnership of us and Korg in the future. But my hope is that we'll actually see more coming from the community and more integration with the sort of larger littleBits system, but with musical applications like people writing programs for the Arduino that unlock something in the synth kit, like a MIDI looper where you would be able to record MIDI messages and have the Arduino loop that and play it out on multi-channels and stuff like that.
All right, I'm going to go off and work on that right now. Frankly, that sounds like something that'd be a lot of fun to implement, and certainly would be fun to share as well.
Yeah.
Paul, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about this. It was really fun to hear about how you got there, but also to hear how it's clear from just talking to you how much you actually really enjoy the things you're working on. So that's always enjoyable for us as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So there you go. Thanks to Paul for spending the time talking to us. It was really interesting to hear about his work on creating stuff. I just love talking to people that have an active creating life. I want to thank everyone for continuing to keep on listening. I had a really interesting experience this last weekend. I went to see Robert Rich in a house concert, which was just amazing. But beyond that, somebody heard me talking and came over and started talking to me like, "You're Darwin Gross. I recognize your voice." So that's always kind of an interesting thing to have happen. But anyway, keep on listening. Reach out if you have any questions, comments. You can always hit me up at ddg@cycling74.com or Darwin Gross, all one word with the E at the end, on both Twitter and Facebook. And with that, I leave you to it. I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.